Cook's aquaculture come down and they don't ask you, they pretty well tell you, okay? And the government's working hand in hand with them.
Save our bay! Save our bay!
What I try to do in many of the discussions that I have with people is try and move the debate from should salmon farming happen to it's going to happen, how should it happen?
Save our bay! Save our bay!
This has nothing to do with community development. This has to do with developing the profit margin of Cook aquaculture, and also the province seems to think it's going to improve its bottom line as well.
When I got this call saying all our lobsters are dead, I thought it was a joke. It was unimaginable.
Stuart Lamont is Managing Director of Tangier Lobster, a Nova Scotia company that buys and stores lobsters in New Brunswick. In 1996, his company and 3 others were holding 200,000 pounds of lobsters in a natural pound in Back Bay, New Brunswick.
I was assured very, very quickly this was no joke. The lobsters were dead. So 4 companies put their employees and trucks on the road, and at 10 o'clock at night, we wound up in Back Bay, New Brunswick, looking down on a natural pound in which 2 of the 3 components of the facility had been drained dry, and here were thousands and thousands of pounds of dead lobster on the shore. That part of the whole story is very, very fresh in my mind. It's as if I were there last night. Come to find out, to make a very long story short, a salmon farming operation across the bay had a lice problem, and the best and most effective way to deal with lice is to treat it with cypermethrin. Cypermethrin is illegal in Canada, but it is, at least it was, legal in the United States.
The salmon farmers had purchased cypermethrin in the United States, brought it to Canada, and doused their fish with it. The currents carried the poison across the bay, where it wiped out the lobsters. The lobster company sued and won a 6-figure settlement. That was in 1996. This is the headquarters of Cook Aquaculture in Blacks Harbour, New Brunswick. In November 2011, Cook was fined $40,000 for the improper use of a pesticide, and later that month the company and 3 of its executives were charged with 33 counts of illegal use of cypermethrin after a mass lobster kill in Passamaquoddy Bay in 2009. As I speak, in the spring of 2012, the case is still before the courts. Salmon farms began in Norway and soon spread to Scotland, Ireland, Chile, British Columbia, and elsewhere. But the heaviest concentration in the world is around the New Brunswick Islands in the mouth of the Bay of Fundy. We call them salmon farms, but they're not really farms. They're actually feedlots. Essentially, a net cage feedlot consists of bags of netting hanging from floating platforms. Tens of thousands of small fish are dumped into the nets, fed, and held until they reach market size. Then they're pumped out and slaughtered. These farms can be enormous. The 2 new farms in St. Mary's Bay are licensed for 1.4 million fish. But compact monocultures like this are a paradise for parasites and disease. And because net cages just hang in the water, all kinds of things can pass in and out through the mesh, from small fish and crustaceans to viruses, bacteria, parasites, and pesticides. And so certain problems occur with salmon net cages everywhere, just as naturally as green grass occurs in the spring.
The basic problem with farm salmon is they break the natural laws. In nature, the wild salmon is always moving, so the waste never collects. And pathogens have a lot of trouble jumping fish to fish because they're constantly moving, and any salmon that's a little bit slow, a little bit wobbly on the edge of the school, there's a predator takes it out. At every age class and size, there's always predators trimming up these schools, and so you don't get epidemics.
Alexandra Morton was once described by a journalist as the citizen scientist who overcame intimidation by bureaucrats, indifference from government scientists, and dismissals from industry to force the plight of wild salmon to the top of British Columbia's political agenda.
Then you take now a salmon farm. It really doesn't matter what you put in there, whether you put a Pacific salmon or an Atlantic salmon, it's the same dynamic. The wild fish come by and they infect the farm fish. That's definitely part of the dynamic. Sea lice, viruses, bacteria. The wild fish go into the rivers, they die. The farm fish, everybody is pressed together, and so the pathogens are having a heyday. They're jumping fish to fish to fish, and now they're competing against each other, so it increases virulence. This has actually been studied. It makes them more virulent because there's no longer any reason for those pathogens to live lightly on their host.
Take sea lice, for example, small crustaceans that lock onto salmon and feed on their mucus, blood, and skin, creating deep open wounds that provide an invasion route for bacteria and viruses. A few sea lice can kill an immature salmon, and larger numbers can weaken or kill even a fairly large fish. To combat sea lice, salmon net cage operators lace their food pellets with drugs and pesticides. As the lice become resistant to those chemicals, the operators move to stronger ones. They may also pump the fish into tank boats, where the fish are bathed in chemicals like hydrogen peroxide. When that fails, some operators, at least, move to strong but illegal pesticides like cypermethrin. And that's the story behind the chemical kill that wiped out Stuart Lamont's lobsters in 1996 and wiped out thousands more in 2009. Drugs aren't the only foreign substance in salmon feed. The flesh of farmed salmon is white, not salmon-colored. It arrives in the supermarket salmon-colored because it's had dye in its food. Other fish sometimes pick up salmon feed that's fallen through the cages with odd results. And, as naturally as birdsong in summer, masses of salmon produce masses of feces. Wild Atlantic salmon spread their wastes over huge stretches of ocean. They migrate between eastern Canada and Greenland, but farm salmon drop their wastes right through the bottoms of their cages.
1,800 metric ton of waste. That's what these sites in 1 year are going to produce.
Yeah.
And that is the equivalent of Digby County, all going to the bathroom. That's what's being dumped down here on our bottom every year when they get up into production. They can come shit all over us, and they don't have to look after their waste. That's why they have 52% profit.
The industry is not paying for the waste that it's generating. That's being borne by the environment and all the other species that inhabit that environment where fish farms are located. It's really one of those, it's out of sight and out of mind to most people. Most people don't get to see what it's like under a fish farm. All they get to see is on the surface, and it looks very nice. Leaping salmon, being tossed food, but underneath it's really it's a waste dump. It's a sewage type environment.
What's on the bottom is a toxic sludge up to 1 meter in depth, composed of feces, putrefying food, and dead, disintegrating fish, all spiced with drugs, other chemicals, and dyes. Nothing can live there except a specialized worm and a carpet of bacteria.
So what you have here, this is my farm site, and you can see these white patches that are quite extensive. These are the Beggiatoa or Beggiatoa mats, these bacterial mats that are covering the surface. This bottom is toxic, and organisms really are quite sensitive to the sulfur levels that are there, and they would stay away from it.
Of the diseases that affect salmon feedlots, the most devastating is ISA, infectious salmon anemia, which arose in Norway and has since spread around the world, often carried by infected eggs. It's incurable, and when it appears, all the hundreds of thousands of salmon in the affected cages have to be slaughtered. ISA almost eradicated the industry in Chile, and there have been several major outbreaks in New Brunswick. Another issue. Unlike most farm animals, salmon are carnivores, so their feed is made up of, well, here's Daniel Pauly of the University of British Columbia, one of the most eminent fisheries scientists in the world.
Lots of marine fish are predators, and these predators have to be fed with other fish, with fish meal from other fish, and there is no getting around that. About 1/3 of the fish that are reported reported caught about 25 million, 30 million tons of fish is turned into fish meal. It's reduced to fish meal and fish oil. Of that amount, half is used for chicken and pigs and stuff, and half for salmon and other fish. So 1/6 of all fish caught is used to grow other fish. If you feed them with other things than fish, they will taste like tofu, they will get sick, and it doesn't work. So basically aquaculture needs fish to produce fish. This form of aquaculture. The production of carnivores, the more you produce, the less fish you have. This is something that will not get into the head of most people because they see a salmon, but they don't see the sardine that go into feeding it. And in Canada, at least, they wouldn't eat the sardine, but everywhere else in the world they would. So this is more than a zero-sum game. This is, we lose when we do aquaculture, humanity, when you do aquaculture of carnivores.
Perhaps the most serious long-term effect of salmon feedlots is genetic pollution, the result of interbreeding between wild salmon and escaped farm salmon. This issue is acute in British Columbia, where Atlantic salmon are an alien species, but it's also an important issue on the Atlantic coast. Wild salmon are born in the shallow headwaters of rivers and spend the first part of their lives in freshwater before swimming down to the sea. They live in the ocean for a year or two or more, depending on their genetic programming. And then, navigating with incredibly subtle chemical sensing, they force their way back up the same river to the very spot where they were born. Every population from every single stream is unique, but they all make that incredible journey adapting to two utterly different environments. A farm salmon doesn't have that genetic programming. When escaped farm salmon interbreed with wild fish, they weaken the survival mechanisms of the wild stock. And there are always escapes, just as there are always sea lice. Escapes occur as naturally as snow in winter.
Farming salmon, farming fish for food certainly makes sense on a lot of different levels. It takes pressure off wild stocks. In fact, the Atlantic Salmon Federation was very involved with helping the aquaculture industry get started here in this part of New Brunswick in the Maritimes back 25 years ago. What the Atlantic Salmon Federation didn't see, or scientists at the time didn't see, was all the unintended consequences, and that is problems with disease, serious problems with disease, serious problems with sea lice, serious problems with pollution, and maybe the most important, significant problem, the fact that a lot of farm salmon escape.
Jonathan Carr is Director of Research and Environment at the Atlantic Salmon Federation. Every fall, he and his assistants intercept the salmon entering the Macadavic River as they come up this fish ladder in St. George, a surreal place in midwinter sheathed in ice. They examine every single fish. They remove the farmed salmon and send the wild ones on their way.
When we first started our monitoring program back in 1992, there were years when we had close to 1,000 escapees coming into this one river, and this is only one river we're monitoring. There's several local rivers nearby and many other salmon rivers. But as time has gone on, there has been improvements in terms of husbandry practices. We've noticed the scale of escapes have gone down dramatically over the years. But that said, so has the wild returning salmon. So we've had years where we've had over 90% of the fish entering this river or intercepted at this particular fish ladder. Over 90% have been aquaculture escapees versus 10% or less of wild fish.
Since 2010, salmon farms have been obliged to report any escapes. But before that, says Carr, the first sign of an escape was typically the sudden appearance of numerous farm salmon in the mouths of the lower Fundy rivers. The industry always claims that their cages won't fail and their fish won't escape. But just one episode in New Brunswick in 2010 saw the escape of 138,000 farm fish. The aquaculture industry says that such escapes really don't matter because real wild fish don't exist anyway. Stocking a river with compatible juveniles is not the same thing as allowing hordes of voracious adult farm salmon to escape into rivers where the native stocks have already been weakened and reduced. Through generations of selective breeding, farm salmon have become so different from wild salmon that some biologists consider them a separate species. And if the spawning grounds contain 8 or 10 times as many farm fish as wild ones, the wild population can indeed be completely overwhelmed.
We took scale samples from wild fish entering the Macadavic River pre-industry, so samples taken from the 1970s, and we looked at samples in the 1980s and 1990s and in the 2000s, and we found that the genetic integrity has been compromised within the Macadavic River. And basically what I'm saying is we've proved that interbreeding has occurred in the past between wild and aquaculture fish, and the wild fish have actually lost some of their unique alleles that are critical for survival in the wild. So the population that we've been trying to recover, we've just found out, truly is not a wild population anymore because of genetic contamination in the past.
What happened on the Macadavic is the most serious effect of salmon feedlots because it destroys the sophisticated genetic composition of unique wild salmon populations. And once the genome of a particular salmon tribe is lost, it's gone forever. In Maine, regulators monitor several different indicators, and when those indicators show environmental deterioration, the salmon farm has to take immediate action. In Canada, the only indicator that's monitored is sulfides, which are produced by decomposition under the cages.
The industry says, we are highly regulated. There's just all kinds of monitoring that takes place on our fish farms. But in fact, what happens in New Brunswick and in Nova Scotia is when the sulfur levels, the sulfide levels in the sediment reach or exceed 1,500 micromolars of sulfide, the response is you do more monitoring. At no point in that process does the government say you need to cut back on production. You need to do something to change those sulfur levels from their seeming trajectory into the high values.
Despite the industry's denials, there's plenty of sound, published, peer-reviewed science on the shortcomings of net cage aquaculture. Indeed, the Royal Society of Canada, the preeminent scientific organization in the country, recently published the report of an expert panel on the relationship between marine biodiversity and climate change, fisheries, and aquaculture. Predictably, it identified the well-known problems with wastes, chemicals, disease, escapes, and interbreeding. The chairman of the expert panel was Jeff Hutchings, professor of biology at Dalhousie University. I asked him specifically about the industry's repeated claims that there's no scientific evidence that salmon feedlots adversely affect wild salmon.
What I would say to those who say that in industry is show me the data. Show me the reports. Show me the publications, because for anybody moderately cognizant of the science that's been undertaken in this area cannot speak truthfully and make that statement.
Net cage salmon aquaculture is also a suspect in one of the great unheralded fishing collapses of recent years, the virtual disappearance of the salmon runs in the Inner Bay of Fundy rivers. 50 years ago, more than 40,000 salmon returned to those rivers. Today that number is about 200. And the issue is not acid rain.
In the Bay of Fundy, in Nova Scotia, we have 23 rivers, the wild stocks of which have simply disappeared. And the rivers are still in perfectly good shape, so whatever has happened there has happened in salt water. And credible scientific sources are beginning to point fingers of suspicion at the aquaculture industry in the Bay of Fundy because the timing was the same as we experienced in Norway, in Scotland, in Ireland, and in British Columbia. So we believe that the open pen aquaculture salmon industry in the coast of New Brunswick, in the outer Bay of Fundy, has been very much a part of the reason for the collapse of the salmon in the Bay of Fundy.
The industry would point at other factors: temperatures, urbanization, power dams, farm runoff, and so on. Fair enough. But those factors also affect other regions, like the Gulf of St. Lawrence rivers, where there aren't any salmon pens and where salmon runs are robust and growing. Science hasn't found a smoking gun. But this is a study of wild salmon populations in the vicinity of salmon feedlots around the world by the late legendary Dr. Ransom Myers. It shows that wild salmon survival near net pens is much lower than in other similar areas everywhere in the world, and that clearly includes the Bay of Fundy. The great environmentalist Paul Hawken recently observed that people all over the world are showing the enormous personal dedication to the natural world that we see on the West River Sheet Harbor, and that this huge global effort makes the environmental movement the largest social movement in the history of the world. That's a phenomenon that governments and corporations ignore at their peril. And so, if I were involved with Snow Island and trying to establish a net cage operation on the eastern shore, I would be pushing for a moratorium myself. If it's possible for Snow Island to do net cage aquaculture sustainably, a huge if, nobody is going to believe that until that claim has been independently verified by qualified experts. In the meantime, they'll be seen as just another participant in a net cage salmon farming industry, which is, to put it kindly, grasping, reckless, sly, and sometimes criminal. And everyone senses that the present plans for expansion are only the beginning. If the industry has its way, every little cove and inlet from Cape Sable to Cape Canso will be clogged with salmon farms. And that's not to mention a similar vast expansion apparently being planned for the south coast of Newfoundland. How has this salmon aquaculture expansion gone so incredibly wrong? The underlying failure, as with so many environmental issues, is a failure of accounting and critical thinking. Governments now assume that any increase in gross domestic product is growing the economy and is a good thing, and that government is responsible for making that happen. But GDP is a bankrupt indicator. What isn't counted doesn't count, and what isn't counted is most of what makes life worthwhile, like clean air and water, a healthy population in a healthy natural environment. None of this shows up in GDP. Furthermore, the GDP calculation only counts the jobs and dollars that may be gained by something like aquaculture, disregarding the existing jobs and dollars that may be lost. Meanwhile, the public pays the cash cost of corporate failure, while the environment pays the long-term non-cash costs. Whatever accounts for the mystery of the province's behavior, this situation is becoming mean and ugly. One fisherman told us that the cages proposed for his community would never go in the water. The local fishermen, fighting back in the only effective way left to them, would destroy the cages first. That's where this is going to end, he told me. It's going to make criminals out of honest people.
It makes people so angry here that we know what the science says. They know what the science says. You know, DFO knows goddamn well, and so does the Sterling Belleville, the Minister of Aquaculture. He knows damn well, and so does his deputy minister, and all of those high-paid bureaucrats who are in that department know full well what these things are doing to the environment, because they have seen the science and they have ignored it intentionally to line the pockets of a company that's not even from here, and also to try and grab some tax dollars for themselves. And it's shameful. It's shocking.
The bizarre thing is that we need aquaculture, and it would be easy to devise an aquaculture policy that almost everyone could support. Alana Mitchell has been called the best environmental journalist in the world. She's the author of Seasick, The Global Ocean in Crisis.
In our lifetime, fish has gone from being mainly wild to mainly farmed as a global, phenomenon, which is stunning. But it is the next logical step, and there are lots of biologists who will argue that it's the only logical step, that it's the natural progression, and that we ought to be spending much more time farming fish than catching it in the wild. The problem is that it's in the detail, and we're not, in most parts of the world, we're not doing fish farming in a very smart way. In most parts of the world, what we're doing is still catching little fish from the ocean to feed to these bigger fish that we're trying to grow in cages.
Almost everyone who takes a hard look at this industry comes up with two questions. The first one is, wouldn't it be better to raise fish in closed tanks, either in the water or on land? Minister Beliveau says the government isn't opposed to closed containment, but the industry tells him it's not viable. The industry says the fish would have to be packed too tightly. The cost of power to pump the water would be prohibitive, and so forth. All of which would be much more convincing if people weren't already doing closed containment all over the world with all kinds of different species in all kinds of places. People are raising fish in disused warehouses in Chicago, on the waterfront in Baltimore, in their backyards. There's a guy in the Bronx raising tilapia for the table in his bathtub. In Quebec, an outfit called Culture Aquaponique uses the same water to raise rainbow trout and Boston lettuce. In that system, waste equals food, just as it does in nature. The truth is that closed containment would be viable in a wink if we stopped subsidizing aquaculture companies for doing the wrong thing. The other big issue is, why salmon?
We tend to be very focused on Atlantic salmon. But 30 years ago, people weren't eating Atlantic salmon, except those who lived near rivers and caught the fish themselves. So fish farming industry has created a market for farmed Atlantic salmon. It could do so again for other species.
Hutchings mentions bass, pickerel, sturgeon, Arctic char, and various others. And in fact, we can also grow salmon sustainably. This tank is made of fiberglass and styrofoam, and it's full of salmon. It's floating in an inlet near Campbell River, BC, and its operating costs are not much greater than net cage systems. All its wastes are collected in a sump and composted into fertilizer. Agri-Marine Holdings also exports these tanks to China and sees good market prospects in Norway, the original home of the salmon farming industry, which has now banned net cage feedlots in certain districts. And this facility, near Seattle, raises coho salmon entirely in fresh water, far from the sea and surrounded by farmland. More than 95% of its water is recirculated. It has no escapes, no lice, no pesticides, no disease, no untreated wastes. Sweet Spring Salmon's fish have achieved super green status from the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Seafood Watch program, and they're now being grown in similar facilities in Montana, within sight of the Rocky Mountains. And just recently, the Atlantic Salmon Federation has begun harvesting Atlantic salmon from St. John River stock raised in a demonstration project at a closed containment facility owned by the Conservation Fund Freshwater Institute in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. The fish were grown without sea lice, disease, antibiotics, or vaccines in water that was 99.8% recirculated.
We are demonstrating to the industry and to DFO that the technology exists to, one, to raise the salmon, and two, we are crunching the numbers to prove that it's cost competitive or cost effective to do so. And the view is, you know, as we continue down this track, to hopefully work with the industry and engage the industry and engage the federal and provincial governments so that we can take this knowledge and this new technology and maybe transition the current industry in the Bay of Fundy and in other areas throughout eastern Canada more towards this land-based salmon farming.
We've been told time and time again that land-based, closed containment, finfish aquaculture just won't work. It's not viable, it's not profitable, it's not sustainable, the technology just doesn't exist. Well, let's go see. Sustainable Blue began as a water filtration and recirculation company serving large aquarium operators around the world. It now raises European sea bass and sea bream in a closed containment fish farm in Centre Burlington on the Bay of Fundy. The company also manages a closed containment facility owned by the Millbrook First Nation near Truro, which produces Arctic char. Sustainable Blue's filtration systems allow the company to pump up murky Fundy water and have it crystal clear in a few hours, and 99.95% of the water is recirculated. All the fish wastes are captured and treated, there are no problems with parasites or disease, and the farm produces a kilo of farm fish from just 2/3 of a kilo of wild fish. The rest of the feed comes from other sources.
I consider this technology on this site to be world leading. It's proprietary. It's developed by one individual who's been working at this for 20 years. And the most important point is that it works. If you canvass opinion and probably even informed opinion on the merits of closed containment aquaculture for marine systems. I think most people who are informed on the subject would even say it's a great concept, but the technology just doesn't work to make it commercially viable. So I know that with what we have developed here, I can say with conviction that our technology is at a level where it is most certainly commercially viable.
Could they raise salmon?
We could certainly raise salmon here. There's absolutely no reason why not.
No reason except economics. Salmon was once a rarity, a high-priced delicacy, but today there's much more salmon growing in captivity than ever swam wild in the ocean. So salmon is now a commodity, like chicken. In the North American market, sea bass and bream are worth 50% to 70% more than salmon. But that raises another question. If your market is in, say, Toronto, and you're not raising your fish in the sea, why build your farm in Nova Scotia? Why not in a warehouse in Toronto?
If you approach general consumers and ask them for their opinion on farmed aquaculture product, they view the east coast of Canada as a nice and a very natural place to produce farmed aquaculture product. And what that says to us basically is there is some marketing advantage for us in selling fish in Toronto that was raised in Nova Scotia. It carries a nice connotation with it.
Once again, Nova Scotia's brand is a major asset, and it's all about purity. Cold, clean water, a pristine environment, just as it is for the lobster industry. Sustainable Blues fish have received the approval of the ocean-wise Sustainable Seafood Program of the Vancouver Aquarium. And the fish is getting rave reviews from master chefs in Nova Scotia, Ontario, and Quebec. It's delicious. I'm impressed, and apparently I'm not the only one that's impressed. Recently, this facility was visited by an executive from a major Canadian food chain, who came out and said, "I have seen the future." All these leading-edge producers say they're responding to a substantial and growing market that's willing to pay more for safe, sustainably produced seafood. So the most powerful player in this whole debate may be the informed consumer. Jim Gourley is a publisher, an ardent sports fisherman, and a restaurant operator. His restaurant serves only what he regards as wholesome food, locally sourced. He won't offer farmed salmon because it won't be accepted by the kind of customer he's aiming to attract.
The public is increasingly demanding to know what they're eating. There are demands for more clarity in labeling. There are demands to know source of food. People want to know what they're consuming with particular concern about chemicals, pesticides, insecticides, and so forth. The general public has been quite ignorant of the realities of salmon. The public is salmon. Well, salmon is salmon. Salmon's good for you. Omega-3 is good for you, and so forth. Fatty fish is good for you, but only if it's not laced with toxins.
It's true. Not many people would knowingly eat food that's been dyed and drugged and bathed in poisons to rid it of parasites. Pretty clearly, net cage salmon aquaculture is a primitive method of food production, the marine equivalent of slash and burn agriculture. In the end, though, this story is not so much about fish and food as it is about values and power. When governments have been captured by corporations, your vote at the ballot box doesn't seem to matter very much. But you also get to vote with this. You can cast your ballot, yea or nay, here, and here, and here, and here. And as more and more consumers refuse to buy this stuff, more and more grocery chains will stop selling it. Important chain stores in Western Canada and the United States, like Safeway, Overweighty, and Target, have already banished net pen salmon from their shelves.
Especially the shrimp in North America.
More than 100 organizations, community groups, conservation groups, representatives of tourism, recreation, and the traditional fishery have now come together in a broad and growing coalition to oppose the granting of further net pen licenses and ultimately to call for the removal of existing net pens from Nova Scotia's coast. They've learned that simply marking a ballot every few years doesn't cut it anymore. If we want a better future, a renewed democracy, we'll have to forge it ourselves, in our communities, at public events, in the streets. That's actually what the people in all these community organizations are doing. This is what democracy looks like. I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for watching.